Now, viewers, as I had said, let's also look at the possibility of these two talks that are taking place, whether they actually lead to a breakthrough and what happens in the event that they don't. Let's put out those scenarios for you here to understand where things stand right now. Now, in the event that talks succeed, now first and foremost, what happens is that the hostages get freed. That includes 20 alive, 28 who are dead, but their bodies are still with Hamas. And troops will start withdrawing from Gaza. How they happen, the timeline of that is a separate issue, but there is agreement on their withdrawal. Second important part, the ceasefire holds as deal gains traction. Now, this ceasefire, how long it will hold, whether there will be some finality to it, a long-term roadmap, all that hinges on the talks actually succeeding to some sort of a breakthrough. So that could be the other important aspect of it. Third and equally important would be that 8 trucks would start going inside Rafah. There is a huge civilian casualty, huge civilian crisis with regard to food and other essential items. That could be prioritized once the hostage deal and the peace deal gets closed and succeeds. Lastly, the other two important part, Hamas signals readiness to disarm. Now, that's the single biggest aspect of lasting peace in the region, because Hamas still has a very large tunnel network. It has huge cache of arms and also wants to govern in the post-war Gaza. So if they are able to set aside these ambitions and ensure that Hamas doesn't have any say, then that could be an element leading to lasting peace. Lastly, path to Palestinian autonomy reopens. What will that be? Will that eventually lead to a separate country? How soon can that happen? All those negotiations and talks will actually come if the talks succeed. Now, let's look at the other scenario, that what's happening in Cairo actually leads to nothing in terms of positivity. What happens then? First and foremost, bombing resumes. It's already continuing. It's not like it's completely stopped, but it renews with a fresh vigor, because Israel realizes that there is no other option to get those 20 alive and 28 dead hostages that are still with Hamas, the only bargaining chip that the terror organization has. Secondly, it halts any withdrawal of its troops, which means the ground assault continues with even more focus on bombarding the area and completely demolishing Hamas. Hostage deal falls apart in Egypt. What happens to the families of those? Well, one cannot even begin to really put that in words. Then Hamas vows retaliation. How will that be armed? Who will arm it? The funding lines, the arms, the weapons, all of that then leads to greater uncertainty and puts the entire region in more spiral of uncertainty and chaos. And lastly, well, you can expect more global protests to actually follow. They've already been there. One can argue that maybe the information war or the propaganda war is something that Israel lost, even as it continued to make deep military gains on the battlefield. All that will come back with fresh vigor, because there is no deal that is really on the table. To talk more on this, let's get in Professor Jangid, who of the OP Jindal University, along with Professor Scott Lucas, joining me on the broadcast. Thank you so much, both of you gentlemen. Professor Lucas, let me start by asking you your thoughts on these two scenarios we put out here. Which of the two look more realistic right now?
Well, I think it's important to cut through the rhetoric that you had just before the break to set out the facts without making a prediction of where we land. First, there is the question of the timing of the release of those 20 hostages held by Hamas and those 28 bodies with respect to two things. First is the release of Palestinians who have been held by the Israelis. And contrary to what you heard just before the break, these aren't all just, quote, terrorists. These include, for example, the man who could be the leader of a Palestinian movement if we do get a ceasefire, which is Mariam Barghouti, who has been held for more than 20 years by the Israelis. Secondly, it is also tied to the question of Israeli withdrawal, which is very vague in the Trump 20-point sketch. How far back do the Israeli troops pull back? Is this on a long-term basis? Not really defined at this point. And then you get to the wider issues that are going to be, require a lot of negotiation. For example, considering the governance arrangements. The plan has no Palestinian representation on this international board, which supposedly is going to be headed by Donald Trump. And then secondly, you have this day-to-day body to administer the strip.
Professor
But
Jangid,
who are the
let me get in, Professor Jangid, on the specific
Sure.
points that you've raised. Go ahead.
Thank you. I do think that Donald Trump needs to compromise a bit more. On 20th of January, before taking the oath, he really threatened Hamas that a hell is coming if you don't release the prisoners. And Hamas really survived all the threats and ultimatums that Donald Trump issued, or the military invasion that Israel is up to. I think what has happened in this deal, which I think is a brighter side of the deal, is that Hamas has been given enough political space to call it a victory. Hamas will have to, will not have to leave Gaza if they renounce violence. Those who will keep fighting can leave the Gaza and get to a country that will take them. And most importantly, Trump had to write this in 20 points that Israel will not occupy or annex Gaza. I think these are really big, concessions on the part of Donald Trump, and I think he, more than Netanyahu, seems to be keen in ending this conflict. I think he has realized his blank check in terms of his political and full backing of the Israeli state for the last 8 months has now started biting him.
Okay.
It's a thing that he is tempted for the Nobel Peace Prize, and he should get it if he succeeds.
Which is why it's 72 hours. Remember, it has to be 72 hours and no longer than that. I'm afraid I have to leave it there, gentlemen. But we are going to continue this conversation because, unfortunately, covering all of this gives me a sense that this is not going to be solved in that one single meeting that will take place in Cairo. But I have to leave it here, viewers.